Our first presentation deals with analytics-driven strategies for e-commerce. Joining me now is Keith Anderson, Vice President of Strategy and Insights for Profitero. Without further ado, here is Keith Anderson.
John, thanks very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I think this is the 9th lead virtual conference, and it's the 3rd or the 4th that we at Profitero have participated in, so many thanks to the Shopper Technology Institute for organizing these great events. As John said, I'm Keith Anderson. I lead strategy and insight for Profitero. We are a venture-backed provider of e-commerce analytics for CPG companies. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the evolution of the channel and why it's such an important opportunity from both a sales and marketing perspective, and some of the specific analytics you can use to drive performance in the channel. So we'll start with just a very quick update around where the shopper, the retailer, and the consumer are, and then we're going to really drill into some of the detail about the analytics that are essential for understanding the scale and the pace of the opportunity and really how to maximize your performance. So I think what so many retailers and certainly CPG companies have begun to appreciate is that we've been going through a period of fairly transformational change, at least for the last 5 years, possibly longer. If you think about some of these technology-driven changes, certainly retailers like Amazon, who Forrester just estimated accounted for 60% of the e-commerce growth in 2015, have introduced this concept of endless aisles and endless choice. And so you'll hear many presenters at many conferences say that the consumer is in control, and part of their empowerment has been the endless choice they have at retailers like Amazon, but also these lower barriers to entry from a business model point of view. You know, you have both new entrants on the retailer side like Jet and Instacart and Boxed, and on the brand side like The Honest Company and Dollar Shave Club and many others that are creating more and more choice for consumers than ever before. And with social, it's incredibly easy for these retailers and brands to push messaging in an incredibly targeted way to exactly the shopper or the consumer they want to reach. And conversely, with the rise of search, it's easier than ever for a shopper to pull and find exactly what they want to find. In other words, if they're looking for gluten-free cereal or they're looking for a paleo-friendly diet, they don't necessarily need to go to the store and walk a physical aisle, although most still do. But when they're researching or planning a trip to the store, or if they want to shop online, they can pull pretty comfortably. And of course, with mobile, which is almost, we're about a decade into the smartphone era, they're connected in any environment. And so every environment, every occasion has become a point of research and a point of purchase. And there are some things that are on the horizon that I think are setting up new questions. We went from focusing on the physical shelf, and I think you're going to hear a great presentation from Video Mining later today about how to audit and analyze your presence at the physical shelf. And then the industry started focusing on the digital shelf, where we at Profitero spend a lot of our energy monitoring your presence and your performance on online retailer sites. And on the horizon now, with things like these dash buttons and Amazon's Echo and conversational commerce, we're entering a world where there may be no shelf. In other words, so much of consumption in a few years could be driven by automatic replenishment or spoken voice commands that I think people are starting to explore these new consumption dynamics and think about how to make sure that our products are discoverable in these new paradigms. And the subscription piece is a really key part of this, because if you take these two developments together, the screenless commerce phenomenon and subscriptions, we've spent so much energy on these moments of truth in the industry. The first moment of truth popularized by Procter & Gamble, which is at the physical shelf. And then in 2011, Google introduced this concept of the zero moment of truth, which actually comes before the first moment. When a shopper is researching products online, you now have what we sometimes call recursive moments of truth, or the forever moment of truth, which is that moment when a shopper commits to subscribe to a product or to reorder a product. So it's a single decision point that has really significant long-term implications as a household effectively annuitizes its consumption with a specific retailer in a specific brand and a specific SKU over the long term. So it's creating a very interesting and challenging new dynamic. And so when you look at where the industry is headed and the role that insights and analytics and data really play, given the pace of change and given the intensifying competition with new market entrants on both sides, retailer and brand, we see increasingly a little bit of a divergence in the role that insights and analytics play. On the left side of this slide is Amazon's growth model. This is something that Bezos drew almost 20 years ago to explain to his employees and investors how Amazon grows. And I think we're not the first to say, but we often say that Amazon is effectively a platform. And so much of their business is automated and algorithmic that the role of insights and analytics with Amazon really has to do with understanding the drivers of performance and measuring that performance so that you know how you're doing. And I'll go into some depth about what you measure and how you measure it. Then you look at traditional retailers that are now omni-channel and are introducing their own online models, some similar to Amazon with a national ship delivery business, and others with local full basket click and collect. And what we see increasingly in that side of the industry is a more traditional approach to partnership. This question around the notion of category captaincy in an omni-channel or an e-commerce world has much more relevance in these models that are inherently limited assortment, where unlike Amazon's endless aisle, we do have to be thoughtful and selective about what we carry and how we price, because by definition we're limiting the range. And so some of the same analytics certainly apply, some of the same fundamental drivers of how a brand or a product is discovered, considered, selected, and purchased apply in each of these models. But the commonality is definitely that more than ever, your performance depends on visibility really on a daily basis to an incredibly granular level about the shopper, the shelf, whether it's the physical shelf or the digital shelf, and ultimately outcomes like sales and market share. And when you think about these full basket players, like not just Walmart grocery with their click and collect model and their local delivery model, but players like Peapod or Kroger with ClickList, there are essentially three pathways that a shopper takes to your products in the e-commerce landscape. The first of which is searching, so literally going to a search bar and searching for cereal, to use that example again. The second is browsing, which is typically clicking through the retailer's taxonomy or the hierarchical menu of departments and categories. And the third that's so relevant in these full basket models is your past purchases, your favorites list or your shopping list. And so there's so much emphasis increasingly on getting on that list. And when you think about what's happening with the Amazon Echo and the Dash replenishment service, which actually integrates with physical products like water filters, this Amazon's choice idea positions Amazon as a kingmaker. And so again, I emphasize the dynamic that these new retail models are setting up has a lot to do with taking individual decisions to buy a product or a brand at a point in time, but then amplifying them over time, because that individual decision actually represents not just a one-time transaction, but potentially recurring purchases, or at least the suggestion in the future to buy that same product again. And we spend a lot of our time working with major CPGs in the industry. Among our clients are companies like General Mills and L'Oreal and Coca-Cola and many others. And we did a survey not only among our customers but the industry at large, and had more than 80 brands globally respond. And to me, having worked in the CPG industry and e-commerce for the better part of a decade, there are strong signs that the channel is maturing. Almost 2/3 of the industry now has one or more dedicated e-commerce directors, and among those, about 40%, 38% have an e-commerce director with prior experience at a CPG. So somebody who's fluent not only in e-commerce and digital retailing, but also in the consumer packaged goods industry, which is often the harder thing for a new leader to learn. And just about half have a mix of in-house and external resources. And then you can also see there are more and more dedicated resources being assigned at the account level. So not only are more brands appointing someone with strategic and often commercial responsibility for the channel at a country level or even a global level, but in recognition of the importance of understanding the drivers of performance with individual accounts, almost half now have a dedicated Amazon team lead or a dedicated Amazon team. About a quarter have someone focused on e-commerce at Walmart, and almost 1 in 5 have someone assigned to Target. So all of these we take as signs that the industry is starting to recognize the importance of the channel. And there's no question e-commerce still accounts for low to mid single digit shares of overall sales across all channels of distribution. But there's data from Boston Consulting Group that projects that as much as half of all growth in the industry is going to come from online sales over the next several years. And an even larger percentage of sales are increasingly influenced digitally, some of which happens on retail sites or retail apps, some of which happens in other digital touch points like deal sites and coupon sites. But I think respecting both the selling opportunity and the influence of the channel is behind a lot of the investments we see brands making. So I want to talk in a little bit more depth here about some of the insights and analytics that we see more and more CPG companies focusing on to drive performance. And I'll set it up this way. If you think about what we've already said about the different dynamics between a heavily automated retailer like Amazon that really is more of a platform, and then conversely the dynamics of the more partnership-oriented retailers like a Walmart, I think you'll find that some of the same types of analytics that are useful in a brick and mortar environment have counterparts in an online environment. And so the first thing that we see many brands looking at is the shopper itself. And our friends at Nielsen, as you may have seen, Profitero is the exclusive CPG e-commerce analytics partner to Nielsen. This shopper shelf sales framework is a really key part of the way they view measurement of the total consumer and the total e-commerce channel. And while we at Profitero don't do any shopper analytics, it is important to understand the demographics, attitudes, and behaviors of shoppers, and not narrowly in the context of e-commerce alone, but in the broader sort of total market context. And then we think absolutely you have to understand the retail environmental context, and that is physical and digital. So I'm really glad to see that there's a presentation today about the importance of retail execution in the physical world, because there is no strategy strong enough to overcome poor execution. And that translates to the digital shelf in a lot of ways. So the same way that in a physical store you care about whether your products are at eye level and brand blocked and have the right facings, and that display that you paid for has been executed, some of those same concepts are true on Amazon or Walmart.com or in a mobile app. That is, if somebody searches for your products, you want to make sure that you have optimal placement. And just like in a brick and mortar store, if you're not available on shelf, you can't convert that shopper. So analyzing the presence of your brand and competitors' brands in the retail environment itself is pretty fundamental. And a lot of what you can take action on in that retail environment we think of as inputs or drivers of your business in the retail environment, and sales, that is, sales and share, are really the outcomes. In other words, focus on what you can manage actively, things like pricing and promotion and stock availability and discoverability, and then link it to the outcomes. And what we found is in the online channel, largely due to unavailability of those kinds of metrics and analytics, a lot of brands have focused on maybe one or two of these three pillars. It's only now that they're beginning to have the ability and ability driven by availability of the data, and secondly, availability of internal resources to get the complete picture of what drives their performance online. And so they're starting to look at the drivers of their business. They're starting to look at the outcomes, that is their sales and their share, and they're starting to close that loop between looking at the drivers, looking at the outcomes, and continuously refining their approach so that they're focused on what moves the needle. So again, I want to share a little bit of data from this survey that we conducted, and all I'm sharing today are some excerpts from it. If you're interested in the complete study, I encourage you to go to Profitero.com and visit the Knowledge Center where you can download the entire study. But what we found when we surveyed more than 80 brands is that the KPIs are definitely heavily skewed to sales and share. So I think just as in the offline world, one of the fundamental things we need to understand is how big is the market, how quickly is it growing, and what are my brand share within the categories I compete in. That remains one of the most fundamental analytics for the online world. The challenge has been that until now, essentially, those fundamental KPIs, key performance indicators, have largely been unavailable or available in an inconsistent way across retailers. And so we at Profitero last year introduced analytics that estimate the size of a category at Amazon specifically and the growth rate of that category and individual brands and manufacturer share of the category, which we think has been a really important step forward in making this critical metric available to companies who are trying to decide how much to invest. Some deciding whether to invest at all in the channel, but most deciding, well, how much and how are we doing? And it's a pretty key element of our alliance with Nielsen, whose sales and share measurement transcends Amazon and is focused on the total market. You will notice that there's a bit of a divergence between the U.S. and the rest of the world in terms of this focus on increasing brand awareness. So the U.S. really under-indexed versus the rest of the world, which we think is potentially an oversight, because if you think back to the statement I made earlier about the disproportionate influence that digital increasingly has over offline, in the near term and potentially in the long term, the greatest value that the digital shelf and e-commerce may represent isn't necessarily volume moving through the channel, but it's the fact that more and more shoppers are discovering products, researching products, and selecting products when they're looking at these digital touch points, even if they ultimately go to a physical store to transact. So we think in some sense the rest of the world is a little bit ahead of the U.S. in the way they think about this. And it isn't that you should focus on one or the other. We think that both are important, and a complete view of the channel includes both. We also asked respondents, how are you doing? In other words, against these key performance indicators that you've identified for yourself, how are you performing? And most companies feel they're performing somewhat well or not too well. But we definitely saw a little bit of a polarized response from folks that were saying they were doing extremely well. More in the U.S. said they were doing extremely well than in the rest of the world. Excuse me, more in the U.S. said they were doing extremely well than the rest of the world. And the same was true for CPG companies versus non-CPG FMCG. So think of toy companies, sporting goods, those kinds of categories. But we definitely saw a pretty significant percentage of respondents who said we're not doing well at all. In fact, outside of the U.S., almost half said we're not doing well. And as we drilled in a little bit, folks started to tell us part of it was they just didn't have visibility into what drives performance. In other words, they can't manage what they aren't or can't measuring. And so part of the gap comes down to having the facts and the data and the analytics to really know what moves the needle. So I want to spend a few minutes here on these performance drivers, and going back to the way that shoppers discover and consider products. Search is certainly at Amazon, but at many online retailers, the dominant pathway to products. This is not necessarily news, but there was data from Bloomreach last fall that validated that Amazon is the premier destination for product search online. More shoppers go to Amazon before Google when they know what they're looking for and either want to find it or research it. And so what it sets up is that similar to the way that in a physical store we want to make sure that there are clear sight lines to our aisle and that we're placed really prominently either on the end cap or at eye level in the physical aisle, more and more brands are really optimizing around their placement in search results. And so what they're measuring is for both branded and unbranded terms, an unbranded term being something like cinnamon rolls and a branded term being something like Entenmann's, they want to maximize really two metrics. The first of which is their share of that first page of results. Because we now know that under a third of shoppers will browse past the first page of search results. And as we've gotten more visibility into shopper behavior, as it turns out, you really want to maximize your presence what we call above the fold, which is on the first several positions on that first page of results before a shopper has to scroll down the page. And so we help our customers monitor their performance on a daily basis for terms that we help identify, which is really key because if you think about the intent that is signaled by a search on a retail site, it's really, really strong. The shopper who is searching for a product on a retail site is much closer to a transaction than somebody who starts at Google. And so knowing what they're searching for and monitoring your placement for those search terms is really key. And maximizing the number of products you've got on the first page of results and your position on those top 5 positions above the fold is critical. And so just to bring this to practical use, typically you'll want to understand for the most heavily searched terms how you're performing on these two indicators and work from the terms where you've got the lowest presence on the first page above the fold and try to identify the factors you can actually impact to improve your position. And we've observed a lot of brands have sort of stopped by identifying that they have an issue. That is, they may discover that they aren't very well positioned for a term that's really relevant to their portfolio of products, but they don't know what to do to improve it. And the reality is there are some tactics that are not unlike search engine optimization in a traditional Google sense. You know, your content plays a really critical role in the way your products show up in results. So we also analyze things like the density of that search keyword in the product title or the description, and then other demand signals like a product's bestseller rank if we're talking about Amazon as an example. And the outcome of this is suddenly you can identify where you're not as well placed or well positioned as you should be, and you can identify some of the potential enhancements you can make to your content that will improve your position for those terms. And it leads to this incredibly powerful flywheel effect, because if you're well positioned in search, more shoppers see your product, and assuming you've got a relevant product for that term, you'll sell more. And in addition to your content and the relevance of that content to the term shoppers use, another key factor is sales. So the more relevant your content, the better you rank. The better you rank, the more you sell. The more you sell, the better you rank. And it becomes really challenging for competitors to unseat the brands and the products that hold some of those positions above the fold on the first page of results. So I've spent a few minutes here because this is a top 5 work stream for the CPG companies that are really committed to growing and winning in the online channel. You know, there's another form of content that we think is largely undertapped for shopper and consumer insight, and that's ratings and reviews. And so there are a handful of impacts that ratings and reviews have in the channel. Certainly products with no reviews are viewed skeptically by shoppers, and so there can be impacts on your conversion rate if there isn't enough social proof for a product. And you know, negative ratings, while they are inherently negative, aren't all bad. A blend of positive and negative ratings has been shown to reinforce the authenticity and the integrity of reviews, and shoppers actually are likelier to purchase a product that has a mix as long as the average star rating is generally positive. And those negative ratings can also create an opportunity to showcase customer service responsiveness, because some retailers, including Amazon, allow brands to respond directly on a product page from a credentialed account. So that's another important idea. But one of the really interesting and, as I say, undertapped sources of insight is the actual text of those reviews. So we definitely encourage brands, identify the products that have no reviews or too few reviews. Definitely pay attention to the velocity with which new reviews are coming in and respond to those negative reviews. But importantly, look at what shoppers are saying, because we increasingly find that there's a disconnect between what shoppers are using to describe products, their vocabulary, and the marketing vocabulary that brands themselves are using when they write product titles and descriptions. And some shopper or consumer vocabulary is too informal or not precise enough to consider using it, but we definitely have customers who have drilled into the text of reviews and used some of the shopper's vocabulary from verified purchases to enhance their product title or their product description to be more relevant to what people actually think about or are saying about the product.
Keith, we had a question just come in our chat box. What are the key drivers for search queries? Mass media such as TV audio drive brand recognition to drive need states or search activity?
Sure. Yeah, so if I'm following the question, it seems like the spirit of the question is, what can you do to generate demand that is expressed as a search? And I would say all of your traditional marketing, consumer marketing and shopper marketing, can have impacts on search, but the reality is it's mostly organic and it's driven by demand. So it's less about driving specific searches and it's more about sensing and responding to that demand that's expressed as a search. So the first step that we work on with our customers is let's go look at the keyword research tools that tell us what shoppers are searching for. And it's really just driven by demand. If there's a trend for paleo diets, then we'll see in some of the keyword research tools that we use that shoppers are more frequently searching for paleo-friendly products. And if your product portfolio has any relevance to those heavily searched terms, then you absolutely want to be updating your product content, your titles and descriptions, to reflect relevance to those search terms. And you sort of close the loop between monitoring what shoppers are searching for, updating your product content to be relevant, monitoring whether those updates position you favorably in the search results, and then over time monitoring whether that favorable placement in search results impacts sales. And we see universally ranking favorably in search results, particularly at Amazon where search is so dominant, has a huge impact on sales. So I hope that answers the question. And so let me take a moment and just talk about, we've talked a little bit about how shoppers discover your products and consider, and then ultimately the outputs or the outcomes that we discussed earlier on was all about sales and share. And so you need to be able to answer questions like how large your categories are, how quickly they're growing, and what your share is, as well as what your competitor's share is. And so there's value in this from a diagnostic point of view, looking at retroactively what the outcome was, whether you gained or lost share versus competition, and then unpacking potentially why that happened. But we are headed towards some of the same causal analysis that I think many brands do in the brick and mortar retail world, so that you can get predictive. In other words, once we understand the correlations between specific marketing and merchandising tactics in the online channel, things like pricing, promotion, search placement, product content, all of these things, we can start to make better investment decisions before we make them. So we have a sense for the potential lift or the impact of a new promotion, or we know whether to prioritize this search term or that search term. And so it's just essential to have both of these data sets. That is, metrics and analytics about the retail environment itself, the digital shelf, but also metrics about those outcomes like sales and share. And just briefly, this is a little bit in the weeds at Amazon specifically, but there's no question competition among third-party sellers on Amazon's marketplace is really intensifying. And as a manufacturer that sells directly to Amazon, you only get credit for your sales that Amazon sells directly. And a lot of brands, for that reason, have historically sort of willfully ignored third-party sellers. But over the last 3 years, the percentage of paid units that third-party sellers have accounted for at Amazon has increased from 32% to 47%. And what that really means is that there is demand for often your brand's products at Amazon, but you're not going to get credit unless Amazon captures those transactions as the seller of record. And so part of what we are working with more and more manufacturers to monitor and manage is the sellers that have the most steady supply of that brand's products, and which products they're losing what's called the buy box on. On a product page at Amazon, any given product can be available from dozens of sellers, including Amazon, but also third parties. And whichever seller is in stock at the right price and has the best service record is awarded the buy box, which effectively presents that seller as the default seller when a shopper lands on that page. And so sometimes Amazon won't actually carry that product because the supplier isn't selling it directly to Amazon. Other times they do carry the product, but it's out of stock, and other times they carry it, it's in stock, but the price delta between Amazon's price and a third-party seller is so significant that Amazon has to award that buy box to a third-party seller. So the bottom line here is there is demand for many CPG companies' products at Amazon that they aren't getting credit for because they don't have visibility into this and they don't realize what's happening. I'm going to spend just a minute here on product content, which is just incredibly important, not only to your discoverability, but ultimately to your brand's equity and your presence at the digital shelf. So product content refers to your images, your title, your description, and the two things to focus on for discoverability are your product title and your description. And then your primary image is the thumbnail that's presented on search result pages or category pages. So if you ask me what are the three things to focus on first, focus on those. But there are other types of content like enhanced content that goes below the fold, videos, product comparison matrices, and so on that can really add romance to the copy that describes your product and can increase conversion rates and build brand equity. The real key here is that no CPG company we've encountered has really optimized the workflow for developing content, syndicating it to their retailers, auditing whether that content was syndicated correctly, and then strategically investing in enhanced content and refreshing their baseline images, titles, and descriptions. So again, while there's 100 things that you could do to improve performance in the channel, if you can only focus on two things, I would tell you focus on your discoverability and search results and focus on your product content because they're so closely connected, and these two factors alone will impact your discoverability and your conversion rates more than almost anything else. And just briefly, we think most brands are a little bit behind the eight ball in terms of optimizing their content for mobile. But I think we all in our personal use understand that mobile is increasingly a primary device for accessing the web and researching products. But so little content is optimized for mobile today. So there's a great case study that Unilever did basically analyzing all of their product content for a specific online grocer in the UK for what they called the occlusion factor. And that simply meant at a standard viewing distance of about 6 inches, when viewed on a mobile device, so a 4.5 or a 6-inch smartphone like an iPhone 6, how many of the critical elements like the brand, the pack size, and the variant were plainly visible. And what they discovered was that only 25% of the products that they analyzed initially had all of the elements they were looking for plainly visible from that standard viewing distance. So they refreshed all that content and ended up with 80% of all content being plainly visible for mobile. And the good news is while mobile today represents a disproportionate share of page views and traffic to retail sites, it doesn't yet account for a disproportionate share of conversions and sales. But we think part of the reason that's the case is retailers and brands together have not yet optimized their images, titles, and descriptions and so on for that smaller form factor. So we think that's a major initiative that is going to warrant some investment over the next 18 months. Okay, so I'm going to conclude here with a couple of pointers. I think anybody who's embarking on this journey to managing your performance in the online channel needs to plan to spend about half of your time building internal alignment and support. And as you do that, I would tell you that translating the familiar, that is brick and mortar, to the unfamiliar is a great way to explain some of what you plan to do. So if you're trying to explain why product content matters, you might use the analogy that your product content is packaging at the digital shelf. And if you're trying to explain why search is so important, you might explain that just like layout and adjacencies and eye-level placement at a physical shelf is important in brick and mortar, search is key to discoverability and visibility online. And above all else, you know, large businesses are fact-based and data-driven. And so if you don't have the facts or the analytics to justify the investment that you're making, and you don't have a way to measure what you intend to manage, it's very challenging to get the kind of support that you're going to need. So I hope this has been a quick and helpful update and refresh on some of what's happening in the online channel and what you can do to measure and manage your performance. And I'll turn it back to our host to see if there's time for any questions, and if not, you can see my contact info on the screen if there are follow-up questions that you'd like to pose.
Yeah, we have two that I really combine into one, Keith, because of time constraints. Which CPG categories are most developed online, and other than Amazon, which retailers should we focus on?
Okay. So the categories that tend to be most mature online are those with optimal price to weight ratios. That is, the price of the product more than offsets the cost of shipping given the weight and the configuration of the product, and accommodates margin for both the retailer and the brand. So those tend to be a lot of the highly replenishable products, baby products, beauty products. You know, the higher the price point and the more frequent the purchase, the more optimal it is online. But you know, as you see other formats like Amazon Pantry and all of these click and collect models emerging, the economic viability of almost any product or category you would find in a supercenter or a supermarket is going way up. So we're starting to see growth accelerate in a lot of categories that historically have been underdeveloped. And then when you think about where to focus, I would tell you outside of Amazon, your big incumbent strategic partners like Walmart, Target, Kroger are going to drag you here if they haven't already. Walmart, for example, has a mandate. By the end of May, they want suppliers to provide product content for their entire portfolio, whether or not they're actually selling those items on Walmart.com. And I think that's indicative of the direction that a lot of traditional retailers are headed as they respect the migration of shoppers to these new paradigms. And then at the fringes, I would pay attention to some of the players that I mentioned up front, like Boxed and Instacart. Even if you don't yet know how to engage with them directly, they are doing some interesting things, and some of them have the kind of exponential potential that if you're not at least monitoring what's happening, you might wake up in 24 or 36 months. You know, Jet is another example. You may wake up and discover that they're really growing quickly, and some of your competitors have already established a presence there that is difficult to unseat. So I hope that helps.
Okay, thank you, Keith. Very well done, as one of the attendees just wrote in the chat box. To learn more about the information presented in this webinar, please email Keith Anderson at keith@profitero.com.